Victoria Matthews was the youngest female CEO in Portland's tech scene, commanding a billion-dollar empire from her glass tower office. She had everything money could buy, except the one thing that mattered most: time with her dying sister. And the last person she expected to teach her about what truly counts was Marcus Rivera, a pizza delivery driver who showed up at her door during the darkest hour of her life, carrying more than just food in his insulated bag. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Matthews adjusted her Hermes blazer as she stepped out of her Tesla Model S in the executive parking garage beneath the Sterling Tower. At 28, she commanded the 32nd floor of Portland's most prestigious business address, overseeing Matthews' digital solutions with the precision of a Swiss timepiece. Her company had revolutionized social media analytics, turning data streams into gold mines for Fortune 500 clients. The financial magazines called her a prodigy. Businessweek featured her on their cover. Forbes ranked her among the top entrepreneurs under 30. Yet, as she rode the private elevator to her corner office, Victoria felt the familiar weight of loneliness settling on her shoulders like an expensive coat she couldn't remove. Her office was a monument to success, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Mount Hood, minimalist furniture that cost more than most people's cars, and awards lining shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. She moved through this space with the confidence of someone who had earned every square inch, but there was something brittle in her movements, something that suggested the polish covered deeper cracks. Victoria had built this empire not just from ambition, but from necessity. Success was her fortress, achievement her armor against a world that had taught her early that love could disappear without warning. Her assistant buzzed through the intercom with the morning schedule: board meeting at 9, investor call at 11, product launch review at 2. Victoria nodded, already mentally preparing for each engagement, when her phone vibrated with a text from Dr. Jennifer Walsh at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital. The message was brief, but carried the weight of a falling sky. Emma's condition had worsened overnight. They needed to discuss new treatment options immediately. Victoria's fingers tightened around the phone. Emma, her 16-year-old sister, the only family she had left, the only person who could make her smile without calculation or agenda. Emma, who was fighting leukemia with the same stubborn determination that ran in the Matthews family, but whose battle was becoming increasingly desperate. Victoria had thrown money at the disease, the best doctors, experimental treatments, private facilities, but for the first time in her life, she was facing a problem that couldn't be solved with a bigger budget or a more aggressive strategy. Meanwhile, across town in the kitchen of Tony's Corner Pizza, Marcus Rivera was sliding his third delivery of the evening into an insulated bag. The restaurant buzzed with the familiar chaos of dinner rush, phones ringing, ovens humming, the cheerful chaos of the Castelli family orchestrating their nightly symphony. Marcus had been working here for 3 years, ever since he'd moved to Portland to care for his grandmother and pursue his nursing degree at Portland Community College. The pay wasn't glamorous, but it covered tuition and rent, and the Castellis treated him like family. Marcus wasn't just delivering pizza. He was chasing a dream that seemed to grow more distant with each passing semester. Between work and school, he barely had time to sleep, let alone maintain the kind of social life that other 26-year-olds took for granted. His classmates talked about weekend parties and spring break trips, while Marcus calculated whether he could afford both textbooks and groceries. But he'd learned long ago that complaining was a luxury he couldn't afford. His grandmother, who had raised him after his parents died in a construction accident when he was 12, taught him that dignity wasn't about what you had, but about how you carried yourself regardless of circumstances. Tonight's deliveries would take him through the Pearl District, Portland's gleaming showcase of urban renewal, where tech millionaires lived in glass towers that scraped the Oregon sky. Marcus had delivered to these buildings hundreds of times, navigating service elevators and loading docks, while the residents enjoyed their meals in spaces that cost more per square foot than he made in a month. He didn't resent them. Resentment was another luxury he couldn't afford, but he understood the invisible barriers that separated his world from theirs. Victoria was in the middle of a conference call with investors in Tokyo when her phone rang again. This time it was Emma herself, calling from the treatment facility where she'd been staying for the past month. Victoria glanced at the boardroom full of executives discussing quarterly projections and made a decision that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. She muted the call and answered her sister's call instead. Emma's voice was weak but determined. She wanted to come home for the evening, just for a few hours, to feel normal again. She missed their old Thursday night tradition of ordering pizza and watching terrible movies together, back when the biggest crisis in their lives was whether to get pepperoni or mushrooms. Victoria felt her chest tighten. Emma hadn't been home in 3 weeks, and the doctors were reluctant to let her leave the facility even temporarily. But Victoria had learned that sometimes being a big sister meant breaking rules that were meant to keep people safe. An hour later, Victoria was signing paperwork that released the hospital from liability, her signature authorizing a brief home visit that every medical professional advised against. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Victoria's Tesla, wearing a beanie to cover her bald head and grinning with the kind of joy that made Victoria's heart ache. They drove through Portland's autumn evening toward the Pearl District penthouse, Emma chattering about the book she was reading and the poem she was writing, her voice carrying traces of the girl she'd been before cancer rewrote the rules of their lives. The penthouse felt different with Emma in it, warmer somehow, despite the minimalist decor that usually made it feel like a beautiful museum. Emma curled up on the white leather sofa, pulling a cashmere throw around her thin shoulders, and declared that she wanted pizza from Tony's Corner, the little family place they'd discovered years ago when Victoria was still building her company from a cramped apartment above a coffee shop. Victoria hadn't ordered from Tony's in months, her current lifestyle favoring trendy places with expensive menus and waiters who recognized her from the Financial Times.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Involved personal chefs and catered business dinners, but she called immediately, ordering Emma's favorite, extra cheese with mushrooms and a side of their famous garlic knots. Marcus was loading the thermal bag when Mrs. Castelli handed him the address. The Pearl District again, one of those glass towers where doorman wore better suits than most people owned. He'd delivered to this building before, usually to young professionals who answered the door in designer workout clothes, barely acknowledging his existence as they signed the receipt and disappeared back into their climate-controlled lives. But tonight felt different somehow, though he couldn't explain why. The delivery estimate was 45 minutes, but traffic was heavier than usual, and Marcus found himself stuck behind a 3-car accident that had reduced the main arterial to a single lane. He called the customer to explain the delay, his voice apologetic as he spoke to Victoria's voicemail. 20 minutes later, he was finally pulling into the loading dock of the Sterling Residences, the thermal bag still warm, but his confidence shaken. Late deliveries meant smaller tips, and sometimes angry customers who took out their frustration on whoever happened to be standing at their door. Victoria answered the door wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater, casual clothes that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, but there was something in her eyes that he recognized. Exhaustion. The kind that went deeper than physical tiredness, the kind that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. She looked at him with the distracted impatience of someone whose mind was elsewhere, someone dealing with problems that pizza delivery couldn't solve. Marcus began his usual apology for the delay, explaining about the accident and the traffic, but Victoria cut him off with a wave of her hand. She wasn't interested in explanations. She was tired, worried, and focused entirely on getting back to Emma, who was having her first good evening in weeks. Marcus represented an interruption, a reminder of the outside world's inconveniences when all she wanted was to create a bubble of normalcy for her dying sister. The transaction should have been simple. Pizza exchanged for payment, polite thank you, door closed. But as Marcus handed over the thermal bag, he noticed something that made him pause. Through the open door, he could see a young girl on the couch, thin and pale, wearing a beanie that couldn't quite hide her obvious illness. She was laughing at something on the television, and the sound was pure joy despite the circumstances. Marcus recognized that laughter. He'd heard it in hospital corridors during his clinical rotations, the kind of laughter that refused to be defeated even when the body was failing. Victoria noticed his glance, and something cold flashed in her eyes. She stepped slightly forward, blocking his view, her body language clear. This was none of his business. Marcus handed over the receipt for her signature, and she signed it quickly, her tip precisely calculated to 15%, nothing more, nothing less. Professional courtesy from someone who had clearly categorized him as service personnel, invisible except for the function he served. As Victoria closed the door, Marcus stood in the hallway for a moment, the echo of that girl's laughter still ringing in his ears. He'd seen enough sick children during his clinical rotations to recognize the signs, the careful way she moved, the brittleness beneath the joy, the fierce determination to act normal when normal had become a performance. Something about the scene behind that door stayed with him as he rode the elevator down to the loading dock, though he couldn't explain exactly what or why. Victoria returned to the couch, where Emma was arranging the pizza on paper plates, having declared that fancy china was stupid for pizza night. They settled into their old routine, terrible movie queued up, food spread between them, the outside world temporarily forgotten. But Victoria found herself thinking about the delivery driver's face, the way he looked at Emma with something that wasn't pity but understanding. She pushed the thought away. She didn't have time for guilt about her interaction with service workers. Emma was home for one evening, and that was all that mattered. The movie was something ridiculous about time-traveling teenagers, the kind of film they'd watched together for years, back when Emma was healthy and Victoria was still building her company from nothing. Emma kept up a running commentary, making jokes about the plot holes and laughing at her own observations. Victoria found herself really laughing for the first time in weeks, the sound surprising her with its genuineness. This was what she'd been trying to protect, these moments of connection that money couldn't buy and success couldn't guarantee. But even as she watched Emma's face light up with laughter, Victoria couldn't shake the growing awareness that time was running out. Emma was getting sicker despite the best medical care money could provide. The experimental treatments weren't working as hoped. The doctors spoke in increasingly careful language about managing comfort rather than pursuing a cure. Victoria had built an empire by refusing to accept limitations, but she was learning that some battles couldn't be won with determination and resources alone. That night, after she had driven Emma back to the treatment facility and returned to her empty penthouse, Victoria stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at Portland's glittering skyline. She thought about the delivery driver again, the way he'd looked at Emma with something that wasn't pity, but understanding. She pushed the thought away. She didn't have time for guilt about her interaction with service workers. Emma was home for one evening, and that was all that mattered. Marcus finished his shift at Tony's Corner Pizza just after midnight, his car smelling like oregano and melted cheese, his pocket holding enough tips to cover gas for the week, and maybe a few extra groceries. He drove through Portland's empty streets towards his apartment in Southeast, past the food trucks closing down and the late-night diners still glowing with warm light. His grandmother would be asleep by now, and he'd have maybe 5 hours to rest before his morning clinical rotation at the hospital.
Himself thinking about the girl on the couch, her laughter echoing in his memory. He'd learned during his nursing studies that illness affected entire families, not just patients. The siblings and parents and friends all carried their own versions of the burden, their own fears and griefs and desperate hopes. The woman who'd answered the door, Victoria, according to the receipt, had the look of someone carrying more weight than any one person should bear. Marcus had seen that look before, in hospital waiting rooms and family conference rooms where doctors delivered news that changed everything. He'd learned to recognize the different types of exhaustion. Physical tiredness could be fixed with sleep, but the bone-deep weariness of watching someone you love fight for their life was something else entirely. It carved lines in faces and dimmed lights in eyes that had once burned bright with different kinds of ambition. His apartment was small but clean, furnished with second-hand pieces that he'd refinished himself and books that lined every available wall space. Medical textbooks mixed with poetry collections and philosophy, his grandmother's influence evident in the eclectic mix. She taught him that education wasn't just about getting credentials, it was about understanding the world and his place in it, about developing the kind of wisdom that could comfort suffering and honor the dignity of every person he encountered. Marcus had originally planned to become a doctor, but financial reality had redirected his ambitions toward nursing. It wasn't a consolation prize. He discovered during his clinical rotations that nurses often had more direct contact with patients, more opportunities to provide comfort and connection during vulnerable moments. Doctors diagnosed and prescribed, but nurses held hands and listened to fears whispered at 3 in the morning when pain made sleep impossible. Tomorrow he had a clinical rotation in pediatric oncology, the same ward where he suspected the girl from tonight might be a patient. The coincidence struck him as unlikely, but not impossible. Portland's medical community was smaller than people realized, and seriously ill children often ended up in the same specialized facilities. If he did encounter her, he'd maintain the professional boundaries his training had taught him, but something about tonight's brief glimpse into their lives had touched him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Victoria woke before dawn in her penthouse bedroom, her phone already buzzing with messages from her executive team in New York, where the business day was beginning. She moved through her morning routine, exercise, shower, coffee, news briefings, with mechanical precision, her mind already shifting into the strategic thinking that running a billion-dollar company required. But underneath the professional competence, anxiety hummed like an electrical current she couldn't shut off. Emma had texted good morning from the treatment facility, her message cheerful and determinedly optimistic, but Victoria could read between the lines. The nights were getting harder. The pain was increasing despite stronger medications. The treatments that had seemed promising just weeks ago were yielding diminishing returns. Victoria had scheduled another consultation with Emma's oncology team for later that week, hoping for new options, experimental protocols, anything that might change the trajectory they were all watching with growing dread. Her company was launching a new product next month, a revolutionary analytics platform that would likely generate hundreds of millions in revenue. 6 months ago, this launch would have consumed her completely, the culmination of 3 years of development and the foundation for international expansion. Now it felt like elaborate theater, important to everyone except the person whose opinion mattered most to her. Emma wouldn't be around to see Victoria's business empire reach its full potential, and that realization was rewriting every assumption about what success actually meant. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that she'd spent her entire adult life building something designed to last generations, while the person she most wanted to share it with was running out of time to see another Christmas. She'd mastered the art of long-term strategic thinking in business, but she was discovering that life operated on a different timeline entirely, one that didn't respect quarterly reports or 5-year plans or the careful accumulation of wealth and influence. As Victoria drove through Portland's morning traffic toward her office, she passed Tony's Corner Pizza, already open for lunch prep despite the early hour. Through the windows, she could see the family that ran it, an older Italian man kneading dough, a woman arranging toppings, and younger family members moving with the practiced efficiency of people who'd worked together for years. There was something timeless about the scene, something that suggested different values than the ones that drove her own life. Victoria realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd worked alongside other people with that kind of easy familiarity. Her company employed hundreds, but her interactions were formal, hierarchical, professional. She made decisions in isolation, celebrated victories with champagne toast that felt more like obligations than joy, and carried the burden of responsibility without the comfort of genuine partnership. She'd gained an empire, but somehow lost the ability to experience the simple pleasure of shared purpose that she glimpsed through that restaurant's window. The thought followed her into the Sterling Tower, up the private elevator and into her corner office where her assistant was already waiting with the day's agenda. Victoria moved through meetings and conference calls with her usual precision, but part of her attention remained elsewhere, caught in questions she'd never allowed herself to ask before. What would Emma remember about their relationship? What would matter in the end when all the quarterly reports and board presentations were forgotten? That evening, Marcus was restocking the thermal bags at Tony's Corner Pizza when Mrs. Castelli handed him another order for the Pearl District. Different address this time, but the same general neighborhood where Portland's successful young professionals lived in glass towers above the city's concerns. Marcus had learned not to expect much personality from these deliveries. They were transactions, efficient exchanges that let busy people satisfy immediate needs without investing in human connection. But as he drove through the early evening traffic, Marcus found himself thinking about the girl from the night before, her laughter cutting through what had obviously been a difficult time. He wondered about her story, how long she'd been sick, what kind of treatment she was receiving, whether she had other family beyond the exhausted woman who'd answered the door. In his nursing studies, Marcus had learned that behind every patient was a complex web of relationships and responsibilities, fears and hopes that extended far beyond medical charts. The delivery address led him to a different building in the Pearl District, but as he rode the elevator up to the 20th floor, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his life was beginning to intersect with the Matthews family in ways that might be more than coincidental. Portland was a big city, but certain communities, especially those dealing with serious illness, were smaller and more interconnected than people realized. If Emma was being treated at Oregon Health and Science University Hospital, where Marcus was doing his clinical rotations, their paths might cross in ways that went beyond pizza delivery. The thought intrigued him more than it should have. Marcus had learned during his nursing training to maintain professional boundaries, to provide compassionate care without becoming emotionally invested in outcomes he couldn't control. But something about last night's brief encounter had stayed with him, a reminder that behind every door was a story more complex than what appeared on the surface. As Marcus knocked on the apartment door, thermal bag in hand, he realized he was hoping for another glimpse into lives that seemed both privileged and tragically vulnerable. The combination fascinated him. Wealth that could buy the best medical care, but couldn't purchase the one thing that mattered most: time with people you love. It was a reminder that suffering was universal, that the human condition transcended economic categories in ways that were both humbling and strangely comforting. Victoria was discovering that success, when measured against mortality, began to look like elaborate distraction from the things that actually mattered. And Marcus was learning that sometimes the most important lessons came not from textbooks or clinical rotations, but from brief encounters with strangers whose stories intersected with his own in unexpected ways. Neither of them knew yet how significantly their lives were about to change, or how a dying girl's simple wish for normalcy would teach them both what it meant to be truly alive. Marcus had been delivering pizzas in the Pearl District for over 2 years, but he'd never seen someone answer their door with such barely contained desperation. Victoria Matthews stood in her doorway like a sentinel guarding something precious, her designer clothing immaculate but her eyes carrying the weight of sleepless nights. She took the pizza with the efficiency of someone who had learned to compartmentalize emotions, but Marcus caught a glimpse of the scene behind her. Medical equipment barely visible in the background, pill bottles lined up on a pristine kitchen counter, and the unmistakable atmosphere of a home that had been transformed into a care facility. The penthouse itself was a study in contradictions. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy, yet there were small signs of disruption: a wheelchair folded in the corner, oxygen tanks discreetly placed near the walls, and the kind of specialized medical supplies that insurance companies fought over and families mortgaged their futures to afford. Victoria's world was one where problems were typically solved with larger budgets and more aggressive strategies, but Marcus could see in her posture the particular exhaustion that came from facing an enemy that couldn't be bought, negotiated with, or defeated through sheer force of will. Emma appeared in the living room just as Victoria was closing the door, moving slowly but determinedly toward the source of the voices. She wore purple pajamas decorated with tiny stars, and despite her obvious frailty, her face lit up with the kind of smile that could power small cities. Marcus found himself pausing in the hallway, not quite ready to leave, though he couldn't articulate why. There was something about Emma's presence that demanded acknowledgement, not the careful avoidance that most people employed around serious illness. Victoria noticed his hesitation, and something sharp flickered across her features. She was accustomed to service providers who performed their functions and disappeared, who understood the unspoken boundaries that kept her private life private. Marcus represented an intrusion into a carefully controlled environment, a reminder that the outside world continued its relentless pace while her universe had contracted to hospital appointments and treatment schedules and the impossible mathematics of borrowed time. The delivery should have ended there. Transaction completed, professional distance maintained, both parties returning to their separate lives. But Emma called out from the living room, her voice carrying the particular sweetness that comes from someone who has learned not to waste words on anything but kindness. She wanted to thank the delivery person personally, she said, because her grandmother had taught her that politeness was one of the few things that cost nothing but meant everything. Marcus looked to Victoria for permission, understanding instinctively that this was her domain and her decision. Victoria hesitated, caught between her desire to protect Emma from any additional stimulation and her inability to deny her anything that might bring a moment of joy. The internal struggle was visible on her face, the careful calculation of risks versus benefits that had become the constant soundtrack of their lives since Emma's diagnosis. Permission granted with a reluctant nod, Marcus stepped into the living room where Emma had arranged herself on the white leather sofa like a princess holding court. She thanked him with the elaborate formality of someone who had been raised with old-fashioned manners, then immediately undermined the seriousness with a grin that revealed she was still, fundamentally, a 16-year-old girl who found adults slightly ridiculous. She asked him if he knew any good jokes because, she explained, hospital food was so terrible that she needed something to improve the taste in her mouth. Marcus found himself sitting on the edge of the coffee table, sharing the kind of clean, silly humor that he'd learned worked best with pediatric patients during his clinical rotations. Emma laughed with her whole body, the sound filling the minimalist space with warmth that no interior designer could have planned. Victoria watched from the doorway, torn between her gratitude for her sister's obvious joy and anxiety about the variables this introduction represented. Emma was asking Marcus about his job, his family, his dreams, with the fearless curiosity of someone who had learned that life was too uncertain to waste time on small talk. Marcus answered her questions with the easy honesty that he'd developed working with children who could detect insincerity from across a room. He told her about his nursing school classes, his grandmother who had raised him to believe that every person was badly needed and that he should always pay close attention. He told Emma about his dreams of becoming a flight nurse so he could work in remote communities. He told her that being a delivery driver was a way for him to see city life from a different perspective, to learn about the lives of people who might not otherwise cross his paths. He even admitted that he was enjoying their interaction, even though he knew they were likely to never see each other again. He saw the way Victoria watched this conversation unfold, not with anxiety but with a new sense of optimism, a guarantee Victoria could set up for Emma. It was a sense that she hadn't felt in long time, but it was something she desperately needed. Emma, of course, was still the capacity for her to come with a smile on her face each time she arrived for routine checkups or treatments, even though she had no clue what might expect her on the other side. Marcus was learning that sometimes the most important lessons came not from textbooks or clinical rotations, but from brief encounters with strangers whose stories intersected with his own in unexpected ways.
Person carried invisible burdens that deserved respect at his part-time job delivering pizza to pay for textbooks that cost more than his monthly rent. Emma listened with the intensity of someone gathering stories to sustain her through longer, lonelier nights. Her questions revealing a sophistication that illness had forced upon her years before her time. The conversation stretched longer than any delivery Marcus had ever made, but he found himself reluctant to break the spell that Emma's presence seemed to cast over the sterile perfection of the penthouse. Victoria remained in the doorway, checking her watch with increasing frequency, but unable to interrupt a moment that was clearly feeding something essential in her sister's spirit. This was the girl Emma had been before cancer redefined the parameters of her existence. Curious, charming, alive with the kind of energy that made everyone around her feel more interesting than they actually were. When Marcus finally stood to leave, Emma made him promise to visit again if he was ever in the neighborhood. She said it with the casual confidence of someone who had not yet learned that promises were dangerous things to make when the future was written in pencil rather than ink. Victoria walked him to the door, her expression unreadable, but her body language suggesting she was already calculating how to prevent future interruptions to their carefully controlled routine. The hallway outside the penthouse felt colder after the warmth of Emma's attention, and Marcus rode the elevator down to the loading dock with the strange sensation that he had just witnessed something significant, though he couldn't name exactly what. He drove back to Tony's Corner Pizza through Portland's evening traffic, his mind replaying Emma's laughter and Victoria's guarded expressions, trying to understand why a routine delivery had left him feeling as though he'd glimpsed something both beautiful and heartbreaking. Mrs. Castelli was cleaning the prep counter when Marcus returned with the empty thermal bag, and she noticed immediately that something had shifted in his demeanor. She'd been watching him for 3 years, had seen him grow from a nervous young man afraid of making mistakes to someone who carried himself with quiet confidence, and she recognized the particular thoughtfulness that came over him when he encountered stories that challenged his assumptions about how the world worked. Marcus found himself thinking about Emma throughout the rest of his shift, her easy laughter echoing in his memory as he delivered orders to other apartments where the interactions were purely transactional. Most customers barely looked at him, treating him as an extension of the pizza delivery app on their phones, rather than a person with his own hopes and concerns. Emma had seen him immediately and completely, had been genuinely interested in his answers to her questions, had made him feel like his presence mattered in ways that went beyond the food he carried. Victoria spent the evening after Marcus's visit trying to recalibrate the carefully controlled environment she had created around Emma's care. The spontaneous social interaction had clearly energized her sister in ways that the expensive entertainment systems and designer comfort items couldn't match. Emma talked for hours about Marcus's stories, his dreams of becoming a nurse, his grandmother's sayings about treating everyone with dignity regardless of their circumstances. Victoria found herself both grateful for her sister's obvious joy and irritated by her own inability to provide the same kind of authentic connection. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria that she could command rooms full of executives, negotiate million-dollar deals with international clients, and inspire fierce loyalty from employees who respected her strategic brilliance, but she couldn't replicate the easy warmth that a pizza delivery driver had brought to her sister's evening. Emma's illness had stripped away many of Victoria's certainties about what she was good at and what actually mattered, but this felt like a particularly sharp reminder of the limitations of her carefully constructed competencies. 3 days later, Emma was readmitted to the hospital with complications that sent Victoria's world spiraling into the familiar chaos of medical emergencies and impossible decisions. The oncology team spoke in the careful language of professionals who had learned to deliver bad news without destroying hope entirely. But Victoria could read between the lines of their explanations. The treatments were becoming less effective. Emma's body was growing tired of fighting. Time was becoming a more precious commodity than Victoria had ever understood, even in her business dealings where every minute was allegedly worth thousands of dollars. Victoria took a leave of absence from Matthew's Digital Solutions, the first time in her company's history that she had stepped away from daily operations for more than a vacation week. Her executive team was capable of maintaining momentum without her constant oversight, but Victoria struggled with the unfamiliar sensation of being peripheral to something she had built from nothing. The company would survive and even thrive in her absence, which raised uncomfortable questions about whether her relentless focus on business success had been necessary or simply a way of avoiding more difficult emotional terrain. The hospital became Victoria's second office, a place where she conducted conference calls from family waiting areas and reviewed financial reports while Emma slept fitfully in her bed surrounded by machines that monitored every biological function. Victoria discovered that wealth could buy private rooms and experimental treatments and the best medical minds in the Pacific Northwest. But it couldn't purchase the one thing she desperately wanted: more time with the person who mattered most to her in the world. Emma's room on the pediatric oncology ward was decorated with cards from classmates and artwork from children in the cancer support group, a riot of color and hope that stood in contrast to the medical equipment that lined the walls. Victoria had tried to make the space more comfortable with expensive linens and gourmet food and electronic devices that promised entertainment, But Emma seemed to draw more comfort from the simple expressions of caring that arrived daily from people who understood her situation without needing explanation. Marcus was completing his clinical rotation in a different wing of the same hospital, learning the rhythms of night shift nursing under the supervision of veterans who had seen everything the human body could endure and still been surprised by its capacity for both suffering and resilience. He'd chosen the night shift partly for practical reasons. It paid better and allowed him to continue his day job at Tony's Corner Pizza, but he'd also discovered that the nights brought quieter moments where patients and families were more likely to share their stories and seek presence beyond the practical tasks of medical care.
Hospitals revealed different truths in the quiet hours when visiting families went home and patients faced their fears without audience. The pediatric oncology ward was simultaneously the most difficult and most inspiring place Marcus had ever worked. Children faced impossible diagnoses with courage that humbled the adults around them, while families rearranged their entire lives around treatment schedules and medical appointments and the cruel mathematics of survival statistics. Marcus had learned to recognize the different types of exhaustion that chronic illness created. The bone-deep weariness of patients whose bodies were fighting battles they couldn't win, and the particular desperation of parents and siblings who felt helpless despite their fierce love and unlimited determination. Victoria's name appeared on visitor logs and family conference schedules, but Marcus didn't make the connection until he was delivering patient meals one evening and glimpsed her through an open doorway. She sat beside Emma's bed with her laptop balanced on her knees, trying to maintain some connection to her business empire while her sister slept surrounded by IV lines and monitoring equipment. The scene was heartbreaking in its contrast. Victoria's obvious professional competence rendered meaningless by her complete inability to fix the one problem that mattered most. Emma was awake during Marcus's next shift, sitting up in bed, working on what appeared to be a poetry assignment, despite the late hour and her obvious fatigue. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway with the evening meal tray, and her face immediately brightened with recognition and genuine pleasure. Victoria was asleep in the visitor's chair, still wearing her business attire, but curled up in a position that suggested she'd been there for hours without really resting. The recognition was mutual and immediate. Emma remembered Marcus from the pizza delivery, and her delight at seeing him again was so genuine that it cut through the professional boundaries he'd been trained to maintain with patients' families. She wanted to know if he was the nursing student he'd mentioned during their previous conversation, and when he confirmed that he was completing his clinical rotation in the hospital, she clapped her hands together with the excitement of someone who had just discovered an unexpected connection to the outside world. Marcus found himself lingering longer than his duties required, drawn into conversation with a 16-year-old girl who possessed wisdom that most adults never developed. Emma asked about his classes, his experiences with other patients, his thoughts about what made someone good at taking care of people who were sick and scared. Her questions revealed an understanding of her own situation that was both mature beyond her years and heartbreakingly innocent in its assumption that everyone around her possessed the same emotional intelligence she had developed through necessity. Victoria stirred in her chair as their conversation continued, gradually becoming aware that her sister was engaged in animated discussion with someone whose voice she recognized, but couldn't immediately place. The confusion lasted only moments before she identified Marcus as the pizza delivery driver from their penthouse, now inexplicably wearing hospital scrubs and discussing medical procedures with the casual expertise of someone who clearly belonged in this environment. The revelation that Marcus was a nursing student, rather than simply a pizza delivery driver, shifted something fundamental in Victoria's perception of their previous interaction. She'd categorized him based on limited information, had made assumptions about his education and aspirations that reflected her own unconscious biases about service industry workers.
The discovery that he was pursuing a healthcare career while working multiple jobs to support himself and pay for his education forced her to reconsider not just her impression of him, but her broader assumptions about the stories that existed behind every service interaction. Marcus noticed Victoria's awakening and the progression of recognition and surprise that crossed her features as she processed his presence in Emma's hospital room. He offered a brief explanation about his nursing program and clinical rotation, careful to maintain the professional boundaries that his training had emphasized while acknowledging the coincidence that had brought them together again. Emma was delighted by what she saw as evidence that the universe had a sense of humor and timing, but Victoria remained guarded, still processing the implications of her earlier dismissiveness towards someone who was clearly more complex than she'd assumed. The conversation that followed was stilted and formal, with Victoria reverting to the polite distance she maintained with medical staff, and Marcus uncertain about how to navigate the dual relationship of having been Emma's pizza delivery driver and now being part of her care team. Emma seemed oblivious to the tension, chattering happily about the cosmic coincidence of Marcus appearing in both contexts and insisting that it proved something meaningful about the interconnectedness of all things. Victoria's discomfort was obvious to Marcus, who recognized the particular awkwardness that came from realizing you'd misjudged someone in ways that reflected poorly on your own character. He'd seen it before in hospital family members who discovered that the janitor they'd barely acknowledged was actually a medical student, or that the cafeteria worker they'd treated as invisible was completing their nursing degree. The healthcare hierarchy was full of people whose circumstances didn't match their aspirations, and Marcus had learned not to take personally the assumptions that others made based on limited information. Emma's energy was flagging as the evening progressed, her earlier excitement giving way to the fatigue that had become her constant companion since the treatments intensified. Marcus excused himself to continue his rounds, leaving Emma and Victoria alone in the softly lit room where machines hummed their electronic lullabies and the outside world seemed very far away. Victoria tucked the blankets around her diminishing frame, her movements gentle, but her mind racing with questions about coincidence and connection and the stories that existed behind every casual interaction. The shift in Victoria's perception of Marcus was subtle but significant, like adjusting the focus on a telescope and suddenly seeing details that had been there all along but remained invisible until the lens was properly aligned. She found herself remembering their original interaction differently, recognizing her own assumptions and the dismissive efficiency with which she had categorized him as someone whose story didn't merit her attention or interest. Emma fell asleep holding Victoria's hand, her breath becoming deep and even, and she stared at the intertwined fingers with the anguish of someone who realized the desperation of the situation had pushed them into unconscious biases.
Breathing steady but labored in ways that sent familiar spikes of anxiety through her sister's chest. Victoria remained in the visitor's chair long after visiting hours had officially ended, a privilege that came with the private room and the staff's understanding that families of seriously ill children lived by different rules than the rest of the world. She watched Emma sleep and thought about Marcus's easy kindness during their first meeting, his genuine interest in Emma's stories and questions, and her own inability to see past the surface details of his employment to the person underneath. The night stretched long and quiet around them, broken only by the soft sounds of nurses making their rounds and the distant hum of a hospital that never truly slept. Victoria found herself thinking about the assumptions she made dozens of times each day, the shortcuts her mind took to categorize and dismiss people based on minimal information. Emma's illness had already challenged many of her certainties about control and success, and the things that actually mattered when time became finite. But this unexpected encounter with Marcus was revealing biases she hadn't even known she possessed. When morning arrived with its familiar chaos of shift changes and breakfast deliveries and doctors making rounds, Victoria was still processing the implications of discovering that her brief, dismissive interaction with a pizza delivery driver had actually been an encounter with someone whose aspirations and values might align more closely with her own than she'd bothered to consider. Emma woke asking about Marcus and when he might visit again, her excitement about the coincidence undiminished by sleep and medication and the harsh realities of her deteriorating condition. Victoria realized she was facing a choice that extended beyond the immediate situation with Marcus and Emma. She could maintain the careful boundaries and professional distance that had served her well in business, or she could acknowledge that her previous interaction had been shaped by assumptions that reflected poorly on her character and attempt to bridge the gap her own prejudices had created. Emma's obvious affection for Marcus made the decision easier, but Victoria was discovering that changing ingrained patterns of thinking required more conscious effort than she had anticipated. The revelation that someone she dismissed as unworthy of genuine attention was actually pursuing a career dedicated to caring for people like Emma forced Victoria to confront uncomfortable truths about her own capacity for connection and empathy. She'd built her professional success on the ability to quickly assess situations and make decisive judgments, but those same skills had led her to overlook the complexity and dignity of someone whose story intersected with her own in ways that might prove more significant than any business relationship she'd ever cultivated. The Oregon Health and Science University Hospital rose from the hills above Portland like a beacon of medical innovation, its modern glass and steel structure housing some of the most advanced treatment facilities on the West Coast. Marcus had been working clinical rotations here for 6 months, but the building still impressed him with its combination of technical clinical placement and emotional intelligence that drew him to nursing in the first place. Children facing life-threatening illnesses possessed a clarity about what mattered that adults often lost in the complications of daily life. They asked direct questions, expressed their fears without embarrassment, and formed attachments to caregivers with the speed and intensity that came from understanding that time might be limited. Working with them required a level of authenticity that Marcus found both challenging and deeply satisfying. The night shift in pediatric oncology followed rhythms that were invisible to the outside world. During visiting hours, the ward buzzed with the controlled chaos of families trying to maintain normalcy while navigating treatment schedules and medical consultations. But after 8 p.m., when most visitors had returned to their own lives, the unit settled into a quieter rhythm focused on comfort care and the kind of emotional support that happened more easily when the audience was smaller and the expectations were fewer. Marcus had learned to recognize the different types of families that childhood cancer created. There were the optimists who maintained fierce hope despite devastating diagnoses, decorating rooms with motivational posters and organizing elaborate celebrations for small milestones. There were the pragmatists who approached treatment like a military campaign, researching protocols and seeking second opinions and maintaining detailed spreadsheets of symptoms and medication schedules. And there were the families caught somewhere between hope and despair, cycling through emotions with the unpredictability of people whose entire worlds had been upended by circumstances beyond their control. The Matthews family didn't fit neatly into any of these categories. Victoria's obvious wealth and professional competence suggested she would be the type to demand the best of everything and maintain control through superior resources and information. But Marcus observed during his shifts that she seemed almost paralyzed by the limitations of what money could accomplish when faced with a disease that responded to treatment protocols rather than negotiating strategies. Emma's room was filled with expensive comfort items, but Victoria herself seemed uncomfortable with the basic rhythms of hospital life, as if her usual problem-solving skills had suddenly become irrelevant. Emma, by contrast, had adapted to the hospital environment with the resilience that children often displayed when adults around them were struggling to cope. She knew the names of all the nursing staff, understood her medication schedule better than some residents, and had developed friendships with other patients that sustained her through the difficult hours when treatments left her too sick to do anything but endure. Marcus had noticed that she often seemed to be taking care of the adults around her, rather than the reverse. offering comfort to her sister during particularly difficult conversations with doctors, and maintaining cheerful conversation with medical staff who were obviously struggling with her case. The evening when Marcus first encountered Emma in the hospital, rather than her sister's penthouse, she was working on what appeared to be a creative writing assignment, despite the late hour and her obvious fatigue. Victoria was asleep in the visitor's chair, her business attire wrinkled from hours of trying to maintain professional obligations while never leaving her sister's side. The scene illustrated the particular exhaustion that chronic illness created in family members who felt responsible for maintaining hope while preparing for loss, fighting for every possible treatment while accepting the limitations of what medical science could accomplish. Emma's delight at recognizing Marcus was so genuine that it temporarily transformed the sterile hospital room into something warmer and more alive. She remembered not just his face, but details from their conversation during the pizza delivery, asking about his grandmother's sayings and whether he was still taking the nursing classes he'd mentioned. Her questions revealed a sophistication about medical care that came from months of being a patient, but also an innocence about the boundaries that typically existed between patients' families and healthcare workers. Marcus found himself drawn into conversation that extended far beyond his official duties, partly because Emma's curiosity was infectious, and partly because he recognized in her the kind of spirit that made pediatric oncology both heartbreaking and inspiring. She asked about his other patients without violating privacy, wanting to know if other kids her age were dealing with similar challenges and how they found ways to stay hopeful when the treatments were almost as difficult as the disease itself. Her questions revealed someone who had thought deeply about her situation, but maintained empathy for others facing similar struggles. Victoria's awakening to find her sister engaged in animated conversation with someone she'd recognized as the pizza delivery driver created a moment of cognitive dissonance that Marcus could see playing across her features. The discovery that he was actually a nursing student completing clinical rotations challenged whatever assumptions she'd made about his background and aspirations, forcing her to reconsider not just her impression of him, but her broader patterns of categorizing people based on limited information. The conversation that followed was awkward in ways that revealed more about Victoria's discomfort with her own previous assumptions than about any actual conflict between them. Marcus maintained the professional boundaries his training had emphasized, while acknowledging the coincidence that had brought them together in this different context. Emma seemed oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, delighted by what she interpreted as evidence that meaningful connections could develop in unexpected ways and circumstances. Victoria's questions about Marcus's nursing program were formally polite, but revealed her genuine surprise at discovering the complexity of his actual situation. He was completing his degree while working multiple jobs to support his grandmother and pay for school expenses that exceeded what financial aid could cover. His clinical rotations required the same level of commitment and competence as medical school, but nursing students received less recognition and support despite the essential nature of their future work. Victoria began to understand that her brief interaction with him during the pizza delivery had represented a tiny fragment of a much larger and more complicated story. Emma's energy was clearly flagging as the evening progressed, but she was reluctant to end a conversation that had brought her obvious joy during what had been a particularly difficult day. Marcus recognized the signs of fatigue that medication and treatment created, the way children pushed themselves to maintain social connections even when their bodies desperately needed rest. He excused himself to continue his rounds, but not before promising Emma that he would check on her during future shifts, a commitment that felt both professionally appropriate and personally meaningful. Victoria remained in the visitor's chair after Marcus left, processing the implications of discovering that someone she'd dismissed as unworthy of genuine attention was actually pursuing a career dedicated to caring for people like Emma. The revelation forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own capacity for connection and empathy, the ways in which her professional success had perhaps come at the cost of her ability to see the complexity and dignity of people whose circumstances differed from her own. The night stretched long and quiet around them, broken only by the soft sounds of nurses making their rounds and the distant hum of a hospital that never truly slept. Victoria found herself thinking about the assumptions she made dozens of times each day, the mental shortcuts that allowed her to navigate complex business environments efficiently, but might also blind her to opportunities for genuine human connection. Emma's illness had already challenged many of her certainties about control and success, but this encounter with Marcus was revealing biases she hadn't even known she possessed. When morning arrived with its familiar chaos of shift changes and medical rounds, Victoria was still processing the emotional implications of their extended conversation. Emma woke asking about Marcus and when he might visit again, her excitement about the coincidence undiminished by sleep and medication. Victoria realized she was facing a choice that extended beyond the immediate situation. She could maintain the careful boundaries that had served her well in business, or she could acknowledge that her previous interaction had been shaped by assumptions that reflected poorly on her character. Marcus completed his shift with Emma's laughter echoing in his memory, her questions about his dreams and aspirations revealing someone who maintained genuine interest in other people's stories despite facing her own overwhelming challenges. He'd worked with many pediatric oncology patients during his clinical rotations, but few had possessed Emma's combination of maturity and innocence, her ability to find joy in small connections while acknowledging the serious realities of her situation. The coincidence of encountering her family in both professional and personal contexts felt significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate. The following evening, Victoria was alone with Emma when Marcus appeared in the doorway during his routine patient checks. Emma's face immediately brightened with recognition and anticipation, but Victoria noticed that Marcus seemed more cautious than he had during their previous encounter, as if he'd spent time considering the appropriate boundaries for their unusual situation. His greeting was warm but professional, acknowledging their previous interaction but maintaining a professional tone.
Conversations, while maintaining the respectful distance that his nursing training had emphasized. Emma immediately began questioning Marcus about his shift, wanting to know if he'd met other patients who might benefit from her poetry or artwork. She developed a practice of creating small gifts for other children on the ward, understanding instinctively that shared experience could provide comfort in ways that medical interventions couldn't address. Marcus was impressed by her emotional intelligence and her ability to think beyond her own circumstances, even when treatments left her feeling exhausted and discouraged. Victoria observed their interaction with growing awareness of the genuine connection that had developed between Marcus and Emma, something that transcended the typical patient-caregiver relationship and approached genuine friendship. Emma responded to Marcus's presence with enthusiasm that medication and illness couldn't diminish, while Marcus treated her with the kind of respectful attention that acknowledged her intelligence and maturity despite her age. Victoria began to understand that her sister had found in Marcus something that expensive entertainment systems and designer comfort items couldn't provide: authentic human connection with someone who saw her as a complete person rather than a collection of symptoms and limitations. The conversation gradually expanded to include Victoria, who found herself asking Marcus about his nursing program with genuine rather than polite interest. She learned that he was specializing in pediatric care partly because of his own childhood experiences with illness in his family, understanding that effective health care required emotional intelligence and cultural sensitivity in addition to technical knowledge. His grandmother had taught him that dignity was something every person deserved, regardless of their circumstances, and that lesson had shaped both his approach to patient care and his broader philosophy about human relationships. Marcus shared stories about other patients he'd worked with, carefully maintaining privacy while illustrating the resilience and wisdom that children often displayed when facing serious illness. Emma listened with the intensity of someone gathering information about how others had navigated similar challenges, her questions revealing both hope for her own future and genuine concern for the well-being of people she'd never met.
Victoria was struck by her sister's ability to maintain empathy for others, despite facing her own overwhelming circumstances. As their conversation continued, Victoria began to recognize that Marcus possessed qualities that her wealth and professional network couldn't purchase: genuine compassion, emotional intelligence, and the kind of authenticity that came from understanding struggle without becoming bitter or cynical. He treated Emma with the respect typically reserved for adults, while acknowledging her youth, finding the balance between honesty about her situation and hope for continued possibilities. Victoria realized she was witnessing the kind of caring that represented the best of what healthcare could offer when technical competence was combined with genuine human connection. Emma's questions about Marcus's future plans revealed someone who thought seriously about how individual choices could create broader positive impact in the world. She wanted to know if he planned to continue working in pediatric oncology after graduation, whether he thought his own experiences had prepared him to help other families navigate similar challenges, and how he maintained hope when working with patients whose outcomes were uncertain. Marcus answered with the thoughtful honesty that had characterized all their interactions, acknowledging the difficulties while emphasizing the meaning he found in being present during people's most vulnerable moments. Victoria found herself comparing Marcus's approach to patient care with her own leadership style in business, recognizing that both required the ability to remain calm under pressure and make decisions that affected other people's well-being. But Marcus's work demanded an emotional availability that her professional success had perhaps discouraged, a willingness to be vulnerable to others' pain while maintaining the strength necessary to provide effective support. She began to understand that the skills required for excellence in healthcare might be different from but equally demanding as those that had made her successful in business. The evening was interrupted by Emma's need for medication that would likely make her drowsy, bringing their extended conversation to a natural conclusion. Marcus excused himself to continue his rounds, but not before Emma extracted another promise that he would visit during future shifts when his schedule allowed. Victoria noticed that he agreed readily, but also established appropriate boundaries, explaining that his primary responsibility was to all patients on the ward, and that their friendship would need to exist within those professional constraints. After Marcus left, Emma immediately began processing their conversation with the analytical intensity she applied to everything that interested her. She was fascinated by the coincidence that had brought them together in multiple contexts, but also impressed by Marcus's dedication to pursuing a career focused on helping others, despite the financial and academic challenges involved. Victoria listened to her sister's observations while processing her own growing awareness of how much she'd underestimated Marcus during the original interaction. Emma's enthusiasm about their friendship with Marcus was infectious, but Victoria remained cautious about encouraging connections that might become complicated if Emma's condition continued to deteriorate. She'd learned through painful experience that emotional investments could become additional sources of grief when outcomes were uncertain, and she struggled with the balance between supporting her sister's need for meaningful relationships and protecting both of them from potential future pain. The conversation with Marcus had revealed aspects of Emma's personality that Victoria hadn't fully appreciated: her genuine interest in other people's dreams and challenges, her ability to ask questions that encouraged others to share their stories, and her instinctive understanding of how to offer support without being overwhelming or intrusive. Victoria realized that her sister possessed emotional intelligence that probably exceeded her own, despite the significant age difference and Victoria's greater life experience. Emma fell asleep holding Victoria's hand, her breathing steady but labored in ways that had become familiar but never comfortable. Victoria remained in the visitor's chair long after
hours had officially ended, processing the evening's conversations and the growing awareness that her assumptions about Marcus had been both unfair and revealing of her own character limitations. She'd built her professional success on the ability to quickly assess situations and people, but those same skills had led her to overlook complexity and dignity in someone whose story intersected with her own in potentially meaningful ways. The night stretched quiet around them, broken only by the soft sounds of nurses making their rounds and the steady hum of machines monitoring Emma's vital signs. Victoria found herself thinking about the different types of intelligence that success required: the analytical skills that had made her effective in business, but also the emotional intelligence that Marcus demonstrated in his interactions with patients and families facing impossible circumstances. She began to wonder whether her own emotional intelligence had been compromised by years of focusing primarily on professional achievement and financial success. When morning arrived with its familiar rhythm of shift changes and medical rounds, Victoria was still processing the implications of discovering that someone she'd categorized as a service worker was actually pursuing a career that required the same level of education and commitment as her own professional path. Emma woke asking about Marcus and expressing hope that their friendship would continue throughout her hospitalization, her enthusiasm undiminished by fatigue and medication. Victoria realized she was facing questions that extended far beyond her relationship with Marcus to broader issues about how she saw and valued other people. Emma's illness had already forced her to reconsider many assumptions about what mattered most in life, but this encounter was challenging her to examine biases and prejudices she hadn't even known she possessed. The discovery that her dismissive behavior toward Marcus reflected poorly on her own character was uncomfortable, but perhaps necessary for whatever growth might still be possible. Victoria's world began unraveling on a Tuesday morning when Dr. Jennifer Walsh called with the news that Emma's latest test results showed aggressive progression despite the most advanced treatments available. The experimental protocol that had offered hope just weeks earlier was failing, and Emma's body was showing signs of exhaustion that couldn't be reversed through medical intervention alone. Victoria sat in her executive office, 32 floors above Portland, staring out at Mount Hood, while Dr. Walsh explained in careful, clinical language that they were moving from curative care to comfort care, from fighting the disease to managing Emma's remaining time with dignity and minimal pain. The transition from hoping for recovery to accepting terminal diagnosis happened gradually, then all at once. Victoria had spent months learning the vocabulary of oncology, understanding treatment protocols and survival statistics with the same analytical precision she applied to market research and competitive analysis. But nothing in her business education had prepared her for the moment when medical professionals stopped talking about protocols and timelines and began discussing quality of life and end-of-life preferences with the gentle expertise that came from helping families navigate the unthinkable. Emma took the news with a maturity that broke Victoria's heart while simultaneously filling her with fierce pride. At 16, her sister possessed wisdom about mortality that most adults spent lifetimes avoiding, understanding instinctively that fighting the inevitable would only waste the precious time they had remaining. Emma's questions to Dr. Walsh were practical rather than emotional. How much time did they have? What would the progression look like? What options existed for spending her remaining months in ways that felt meaningful rather than medical? Victoria's immediate impulse was to seek second opinions, third opinions, experimental treatments at other medical centers, anything that might offer hope where none currently existed. But Emma gently, but firmly, declined additional medical consultations, explaining that she'd rather spend her energy on living rather than on fighting a battle that was already lost. The decision represented Emma's growing autonomy over her own experience, but it also forced Victoria to confront her own inability to accept situations beyond her control. The conversation about end-of-life preferences was simultaneously the most difficult and most important discussion Victoria had ever had with anyone. Emma wanted to spend as much time as possible at home rather than in the hospital, surrounded by familiar things and people she loved rather than medical equipment and clinical routines. She wanted to continue writing poetry and creating artwork as long as her energy allowed, leaving behind something beautiful rather than focusing entirely on the disease that was claiming her life. Most importantly, she wanted Victoria to stop sacrificing her own life and relationships in a futile attempt to control outcomes that were beyond anyone's influence. Victoria took an indefinite leave of absence from Matthew's digital solutions, delegating daily operations to her executive team while she focused entirely on making Emma's remaining time as comfortable and meaningful as possible. The decision represented the first time in her adult life that she'd prioritized personal relationships over professional obligations, acknowledging that some things mattered more than quarterly earnings and market share and the careful cultivation of business success. Emma's return home required transforming the minimalist penthouse into a space designed for comfort care rather than aesthetic perfection.
Medical equipment appeared discreetly throughout the living areas, while the sterile perfection of Victoria's interior design gave way to the controlled chaos of someone who was actively living rather than simply existing. Emma's artwork covered walls that had previously displayed expensive abstract paintings. Her books replaced coffee table volumes about architecture and design, and her plants brought life to spaces that had been designed for visual impact rather than daily use. Marcus continued his clinical rotations at the hospital, but his schedule often brought him through the pediatric oncology ward where Emma had spent so many weeks. The nursing staff had developed genuine affection for Emma during her hospitalization, understanding that she represented the kind of patient who made their difficult work meaningful, someone who faced impossible circumstances with grace while maintaining concern for others around her. When word spread that Emma was transitioning to home hospice care, several staff members asked Marcus to convey their best wishes and ongoing support.
To comfort care created unexpected opportunities for authentic connection between Victoria and Marcus. Without the formal structures of hospital protocols and visiting hours, their interactions became more natural and less constrained by professional boundaries. Marcus began visiting Emma at the penthouse during his free time, bringing books from the hospital library and stories about other patients who had found ways to create meaning despite difficult circumstances. Emma treasured these visits with an intensity that reminded Victoria how much her sister valued genuine human connection over the expensive entertainment and comfort items that money could provide. Marcus possessed the rare ability to treat Emma as a complete person rather than a collection of symptoms, engaging with her intellectual curiosity and creative interests while acknowledging the serious realities of her situation without dwelling on them exclusively. Their conversations ranged from literature and philosophy to practical questions about nursing school and Marcus's dreams for his future career. Victoria began to understand that Marcus's friendship with Emma represented something she couldn't purchase or provide through her own resources, the gift of being seen and valued by someone whose own experiences with struggle had taught him how to honor others' dignity during vulnerable moments. Emma responded to Marcus's presence with enthusiasm that medical interventions couldn't create, finding in their friendship a source of joy that transcended the limitations her illness imposed on other activities and relationships. The evening that changed everything began like many others, with Emma propped up in her hospital bed in the living room, surrounded by art supplies and notebooks where she continued working on poems despite increasing fatigue. Victoria was reviewing financial documents related to Matthew's digital solutions, trying to maintain some connection to her business empire while remaining available for whatever Emma might need. The penthouse had settled into quiet rhythms that accommodated Emma's changing energy levels and medical requirements. Marcus arrived after his shift at Tony's Corner Pizza, carrying dinner for all three of them, and wearing the combination of exhaustion and satisfaction that came from working multiple jobs while pursuing educational goals that seemed both essential and impossibly distant. Emma greeted him with her usual enthusiasm, but Victoria noticed that her sister's energy was more limited than usual, requiring more effort to maintain the cheerful conversation that typically characterized their visits. The conversation turned to Marcus's plans after graduation from nursing school, his hopes for continuing in pediatric oncology, and his dreams of eventually pursuing advanced degrees that would allow him to influence healthcare policy and patient advocacy. Emma listened with the intensity of someone gathering information about possibilities she wouldn't live to see herself, but her questions revealed genuine excitement about Marcus's potential to make positive differences in other families' experiences with serious illness. Victoria found herself asking Marcus about the financial challenges of pursuing nursing education while working multiple jobs to support himself and his grandmother. His answers revealed the complexity of navigating educational costs that exceeded what financial aid could cover, the exhaustion of maintaining academic performance while working enough hours to pay for basic living expenses, and the constant calculation of whether immediate financial needs or long-term educational goals should take priority when resources were limited. The conversation was interrupted by Emma's sudden difficulty breathing, a complication that had become increasingly frequent as her condition deteriorated.
Victoria immediately called the hospice nursing service, while Marcus, drawing on his clinical training, helped Emma find a position that eased her respiratory distress. The episode passed without requiring emergency medical intervention, but it served as a stark reminder that Emma's time was measured in days or weeks rather than months or years. After Emma fell asleep, Victoria and Marcus found themselves sitting in the kitchen, processing the emotional impact of witnessing someone they both cared about struggle with the physical realities of terminal illness. The conversation that followed was more honest and vulnerable than any they'd shared previously, touching on Victoria's guilt about her previous assumptions about Marcus and her growing awareness of how much she'd missed by categorizing people based on superficial information rather than taking time to understand their actual stories. Marcus shared details about his own family's experience with serious illness, explaining that his parents had died in a construction accident when he was 12, but that his grandmother had subsequently developed diabetes that required careful management on a limited income. His decision to pursue nursing had been influenced by watching his grandmother navigate healthcare systems that often seemed designed for people with more resources and advocacy than she possessed. Emma's situation reminded him of his own family's vulnerabilities, while also inspiring him to continue working toward goals that might help other families facing similar challenges. Victoria began to understand that Marcus's kindness toward Emma wasn't simply professional courtesy or personal generosity. It reflected values and experiences that had shaped his entire approach to relationships and work. His ability to see dignity in every person regardless of their circumstances came from his own experience of being overlooked and underestimated based on superficial characteristics. His commitment to pursuing healthcare education despite financial obstacles reflected his understanding that meaningful work required sacrifice, but also offered opportunities to create positive change in other people's lives. The revelation that Marcus was struggling to complete his nursing program due to financial constraints while working multiple jobs to support his family created an opportunity for Victoria to offer assistance in ways that might benefit everyone involved. Emma had been asking about meaningful ways to use the trust fund their parents had established for her education, money that would go unused given her terminal diagnosis. Victoria realized that supporting Marcus's education might represent the kind of legacy Emma would choose, helping someone whose values aligned with her own to pursue work that would benefit other families facing medical crises. The conversation about financial assistance was delicate, requiring Victoria to offer help without creating obligations or compromising Marcus's dignity. Emma had awakened and joined the discussion, immediately
Understanding the significance of using her educational fund to support Marcus's nursing school completion. Her enthusiasm for the idea was infectious, but Victoria recognized that Marcus would need time to consider the implications of accepting financial assistance from people he'd known only briefly. Marcus's initial response reflected both gratitude and concern about accepting help that might create complicated obligations or expectations. His grandmother had taught him to be suspicious of offers that seemed too generous, understanding that financial assistance often came with strings attached that might not be immediately apparent. But Emma's obvious excitement about the possibility of her unused educational funds supporting someone whose career goals aligned with her own values made it difficult for Marcus to decline without disappointing her during what might be her final weeks. Victoria found herself arguing for the proposal with passion that surprised her, explaining that Emma's money could provide Marcus with opportunities that might otherwise remain out of reach, while creating the kind of positive impact that would honor Emma's memory after she was gone. The financial assistance would cover Marcus's remaining tuition and living expenses, allowing him to focus entirely on his studies without the exhaustion of working multiple jobs. More importantly, it would enable him to complete his education and begin the healthcare career that might help other families navigate experiences similar to what Emma and Victoria were facing. Emma's energy was clearly declining as the evening progressed, but she remained focused on the discussion about Marcus's education, with determination that revealed how important the decision felt to her. She explained that knowing her educational fund would support someone pursuing meaningful work would bring her more satisfaction than any expensive comfort items or medical interventions designed to extend her life without improving its quality.
The opportunity to create positive change through Marcus's future career represented the kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. Marcus spent several days considering the offer, discussing it with his grandmother and seeking advice from nursing faculty who understood the financial challenges that many students faced. The assistance would eliminate the financial stress that had been threatening his ability to complete his degree, while also creating opportunities for advanced education that might otherwise remain beyond his reach. Eventually, he accepted Victoria's offer with the understanding that he would honor Emma's investment by pursuing the highest level of excellence in his nursing career. The weeks that followed were marked by Emma's gradual decline, but also by the development of genuine friendship between Victoria and Marcus that transcended their initial misunderstandings and assumptions. Victoria discovered that Marcus possessed wisdom about life and relationships that her business education hadn't provided, while Marcus found in Victoria someone whose resources and strategic thinking could create opportunities for positive change that he hadn't previously imagined possible. Emma spent her remaining time writing poetry and creating artwork that captured her perspective on life, love, and the meaning that could be found even in difficult circumstances. Marcus visited regularly, bringing books and stories that enriched Emma's final weeks while also providing Victoria with emotional support during the most difficult period of her life. Their friendship became a source of comfort and connection that made Emma's dying process more bearable for everyone involved. Victoria's transformation during Emma's final weeks was profound and lasting. She learned to value authentic human connection over professional achievement, understanding that relationships based on mutual respect and genuine caring provided satisfaction that business success couldn't replicate. Marcus's presence during Emma's dying process taught Victoria about grace under pressure, the importance of being present during difficult moments, and the strength that could be found in vulnerability and emotional honesty. Emma died peacefully at home on a Thursday evening, surrounded by people who loved her and had been enriched by knowing her. Victoria and Marcus were both present, providing comfort and support during her final hours, while also bearing witness to the courage and wisdom she demonstrated throughout her illness. Her death was devastating, but also somehow beautiful, representing the completion of a life that had been brief but meaningful in ways that couldn't be measured in years or conventional achievements. The months following Emma's death were marked by grief, but also by continued connection between Victoria and Marcus that honored Emma's memory while also creating opportunities for positive change in other people's lives. Victoria established a foundation focused on providing financial assistance to nursing students from low-income backgrounds, using her business expertise to create sustainable funding for educational opportunities that might help other families navigate medical crises with greater support and advocacy. Marcus completed his nursing degree with academic honors, crediting Emma's financial support and emotional inspiration for giving him opportunities he couldn't have achieved independently. His graduation represented not just personal achievement, but also the fulfillment of Emma's vision for creating positive change through supporting someone whose values aligned with her own. Victoria attended his graduation ceremony, feeling pride and satisfaction that exceeded anything she had experienced during her own business achievements.
Transformations that created meaning and purpose neither Victoria nor Marcus had previously understood was possible. The pizza delivery that had seemed like a minor inconvenience in Victoria's carefully controlled world had actually been the beginning of connections that changed multiple lives in fundamental ways. Emma's illness and death created opportunities for authentic human connection that transcended social and economic differences, while also inspiring commitments to service and positive change that honored her memory through continued action rather than just remembrance. Years later, Victoria and Marcus would remember Emma's laughter filling the sterile perfection of the penthouse, her enthusiasm for their friendship, and her excitement about using her educational fund to support meaningful work that would help other families facing similar challenges. Her death had taught them both about love, loss, and the importance of seeing dignity and worth in every person regardless of their circumstances or superficial characteristics. The foundation that Victoria established in Emma's memory had provided educational assistance to hundreds of nursing students, creating ripple effects of positive change that extended far beyond what any of them could have imagined during those difficult weeks when Emma was dying. Marcus's career in pediatric oncology had touched the lives of countless families, providing advocacy and support that made medical crises more manageable, while also influencing policy changes that improved healthcare access for low-income families. Victoria's transformation from someone who dismissed service workers as invisible to someone who recognized the dignity and worth of every person had created changes in her business practices and personal relationships that honored Emma's memory through continued action. The assumptions and prejudices that had initially blinded her to Marcus's worth had been replaced by understanding that authentic human connection required seeing beyond superficial characteristics to the values and dreams that actually defined people's characters. Marcus's journey from pizza delivery driver to pediatric nurse had been supported by Emma's financial assistance, but it had been inspired by her courage, wisdom, and determination to find meaning even in the face of terminal illness. Her friendship had taught him that effective healthcare required not just technical competence, but also emotional intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and the ability to honor patients' dignity during their most vulnerable moments. The love story that developed between Victoria and Marcus was ultimately secondary to the more important story about Emma's impact on both their lives, her ability to create connections that transcended social boundaries, and her vision for using resources to support work that would benefit other families facing medical crises. Her death had been heartbreaking, but her life had catalyzed transformations that created lasting, positive change in ways that honored her memory through continued service rather than just grief. The dismissive words Victoria had spoken to Marcus during that first pizza delivery echoed in her mind like a curse she couldn't break. "I don't have time for this," had seemed like efficient communication in the moment, but now those words represented everything wrong with how she'd approached human relationships for the past decade. Standing in Emma's hospital room 3 months later, watching her sister's labored breathing through machines that measured every heartbeat, Victoria finally understood the devastating arrogance of believing that any problem could be solved through impatience and superior resources. Emma's condition had deteriorated rapidly following her transition to palliative care, but her spirit remained unbroken despite the physical limitations that confined her to bed for increasingly longer periods. The experimental treatments had failed, leaving behind a trail of side effects that made simple activities like reading or writing exhausting endeavors. Yet Emma continued creating poetry with whatever energy remained, her verses capturing insights about love, mortality, and human connection that possessed wisdom far beyond her 16 years. Marcus had become a constant presence during Emma's final weeks, visiting after his nursing shifts with books from the hospital library and stories about other patients who had found ways to create meaning despite impossible circumstances. His friendship with Emma had evolved into something precious and irreplaceable, providing her with intellectual stimulation and emotional support that Victoria's wealth couldn't purchase from any medical professional or therapeutic service. Emma treasured their conversations about literature, philosophy, and Marcus's dreams for his nursing career with an intensity that revealed how much she valued authentic human connection over expensive comfort measures. Victoria's transformation during these weeks was both gradual and profound, as she learned to recognize the difference between caring for someone and trying to control their experience. Emma's illness had stripped away Victoria's illusions about the power of money and strategic thinking to solve life's most important problems, forcing her to confront the reality that love sometimes meant accepting outcomes that couldn't be changed through superior resources or more aggressive interventions. The discovery that Marcus possessed qualities she couldn't purchase, genuine compassion, emotional intelligence, and the kind of authenticity that came from understanding struggle, had challenged every assumption she'd made about what constituted real value in human relationships. The evening that would change everything forever began with Emma asking Victoria to help her write letters to people who had made significant impacts on her life during her illness.
Expressions of gratitude while realizing that Emma had developed relationships characterized by mutual respect and genuine affection during a period when Victoria herself had remained focused primarily on medical protocols and treatment outcomes. The conversation turned to Emma's plans for the educational trust fund that their parents had established for her college expenses, money that would obviously go unused given her terminal diagnosis. Emma had been thinking about meaningful ways to honor her parents' intentions while creating positive impact that would outlast her own brief life, and she'd become increasingly excited about the possibility of supporting Marcus's nursing education as a way of extending her own values and priorities beyond her death. Victoria had initially resisted the idea, worried about the emotional complications of financial assistance between people who had known each other for such a short time, but Emma's enthusiasm and Marcus's obvious dedication to pursuing meaningful work had gradually overcome her reservations. Marcus's reaction to Emma's proposal was characteristic of his thoughtful approach to complex situations. Gratitude mixed with concern about accepting assistance that might create obligations he couldn't fulfill, questions about his worthiness to receive such generosity, and anxiety about the emotional weight of using money intended for someone whose life was ending too soon. His grandmother had taught him to be cautious about offers that seemed too good to be true, understanding that financial assistance often came with expectations that might not be immediately apparent, but could become burdensome over time. Emma addressed Marcus's concerns with the practical wisdom that her illness had forced her to develop, explaining that supporting his education would bring her more satisfaction than any experimental treatment or expensive comfort measure that money could purchase. She wanted to know that her unused educational fund would help someone whose values aligned with her own pursue work that might benefit other families facing medical crises, creating a legacy of positive impact that would honor her memory through continued service rather than just remembrance. Her enthusiasm for the project was infectious, but Victoria recognized that Marcus would need time to process the implications of accepting such significant financial assistance. The discussion about educational funding continued over several visits, with Emma becoming increasingly animated as she imagined the positive changes that Marcus might create through his nursing career if financial constraints were removed from his educational path. She researched nursing programs and specialization options with the same analytical intensity that Victoria applied to business strategy, developing comprehensive plans for how Marcus's education could be optimized to prepare him for maximum impact in pediatric oncology and family advocacy. Victoria was amazed by her sister's ability to maintain intellectual engagement with future possibilities, even as her own future contracted to weeks or days rather than years or decades. Marcus spent considerable time discussing Emma's proposal with his grandmother, seeking wisdom from someone who had navigated financial hardship with dignity while maintaining suspicion of offers that seemed too generous to be genuine. His grandmother's eventual approval was based on her assessment of Emma's character and motivations, rather than the financial benefits involved, understanding that accepting assistance from someone whose values aligned with Marcus's own educational goals represented opportunity rather than charity. Her blessing provided Marcus with the emotional permission he needed to consider Emma's proposal seriously. Victoria found herself becoming an advocate for Emma's educational funding plan, recognizing that supporting Marcus's nursing career would create exactly the kind of meaningful legacy that Emma desired, while also honoring their parents' intention to invest in education that would benefit society. The financial assistance would eliminate the exhaustion of working multiple jobs while attending nursing school, allowing Marcus to focus entirely on his studies while also creating opportunities for advanced education that might otherwise remain beyond his reach. More importantly, it would enable him to pursue the kind of specialized training in pediatric oncology that could help other families navigate experiences similar to what Emma and Victoria were facing. Emma's excitement about the educational funding project gave her renewed energy during a period when physical decline had been accelerating, providing her with a sense of purpose and forward momentum that medical interventions couldn't create. She spent hours researching nursing programs, scholarship opportunities, and career paths in pediatric healthcare, developing detailed plans for how Marcus's education could be structured to maximize his potential impact on patient care and family advocacy. Victoria realized that planning for Marcus's future had become Emma's way of maintaining hope and agency during a period when most aspects of her life felt beyond her control. The legal arrangements for transferring Emma's educational trust fund to support Marcus's nursing education required careful documentation to ensure that the financial assistance would be available when needed, while also protecting everyone involved from potential complications. Victoria's business experience proved valuable in structuring the arrangement to maximize benefits while minimizing bureaucratic obstacles, but the emotional significance of the transaction far exceeded its legal complexity.
Emma was literally investing her unused future in someone whose values and goals aligned with her own, creating a form of immortality through Marcus's future service to other families facing medical crises. Marcus's acceptance of Emma's educational funding came with commitments that reflected his understanding of the responsibility involved in receiving such generous assistance. He promised to pursue nursing education with maximum dedication, to specialize in pediatric oncology, where his work might benefit other families facing childhood cancer, and to honor Emma's memory through excellence in patient care and family advocacy. These commitments weren't legally binding, but they represented emotional contracts that Marcus took more seriously than any formal agreement could have enforced. Emma's declining energy made extended conversations increasingly difficult, but she remained focused on finalizing plans for Marcus's educational funding with determination that revealed how important the project had become to her sense of purpose and legacy. Victoria was amazed by her sister's ability to maintain enthusiasm for future possibilities, even as her own future became increasingly limited.
Understanding that Emma had found in Marcus's dreams a way of extending her own impact beyond the boundaries of her abbreviated life. The educational funding represented Emma's final major decision, and she approached it with the same thoughtful consideration she'd applied to all her end-of-life choices. The transformation in Victoria's relationship with Marcus during these weeks was profound and lasting, evolving from misunderstanding and prejudice to genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared concern for Emma's well-being. Victoria discovered that Marcus possessed emotional intelligence and practical wisdom that her business education hadn't provided, while Marcus found in Victoria someone whose resources and strategic thinking could create opportunities for positive change that he hadn't previously imagined possible. Their friendship developed naturally around their shared love for Emma, but it also revealed complementary strengths that suggested possibilities for continued collaboration after Emma's death. Emma's final weeks were marked by increasing physical limitations, but also by the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her educational fund would support meaningful work that aligned with her values and priorities. She spent her remaining energy writing poetry and creating artwork that captured her perspective on life, love, and the meaning that could be found even in difficult circumstances. But she also maintained interest in Marcus's educational plans and Victoria's business projects with a curiosity that transcended her own immediate situation. Her ability to care about other people's futures while facing her own mortality provided inspiration that neither Victoria nor Marcus would ever forget. The evening of Emma's death was peaceful in ways that none of them had dared to hope was possible, marked by loving presence rather than medical crisis, meaningful conversation rather than desperate interventions, and the quiet dignity that Emma had maintained throughout her illness. Victoria and Marcus were both present during her final hours, providing comfort and support, while also bearing witness to the courage and wisdom she demonstrated throughout her battle with cancer. Her death was devastating, but also somehow beautiful, representing the completion of a life that had been brief but meaningful in ways that couldn't be measured in years or conventional achievements. The months following Emma's death were marked by grief, but also by continued connection between Victoria and Marcus that honored Emma's memory while creating opportunities for positive change in other people's lives. Marcus completed his nursing degree with academic honors, crediting Emma's financial support and emotional inspiration for giving him opportunities he couldn't have achieved independently. Victoria established a foundation focused on providing educational assistance to nursing students from low-income backgrounds, using her business expertise to create sustainable funding for educational opportunities that might help other families navigate medical crises with greater support and advocacy. Marcus's graduation from nursing school represented not just personal achievement, but also the fulfillment of Emma's vision for creating positive change through supporting someone whose values aligned with her own. Victoria attended his graduation ceremony, feeling pride and satisfaction that exceeded anything she'd experienced during her own business achievements, understanding that Marcus's success represented the kind of legacy that Emma had wanted to create through her unused educational fund. The transformation from pizza delivery driver to registered nurse had been supported by Emma's financial assistance, but it had been inspired by her courage, wisdom, and determination to find meaning even in the face of terminal illness. The nursing career that Marcus pursued after graduation was dedicated to pediatric oncology and family advocacy, working with children facing serious illnesses and their families who needed support navigating complex medical systems. His own experience with financial struggle and his friendship with Emma had prepared him to understand the challenges that families faced when medical crises intersected with economic limitations, enabling him to provide advocacy and support that went beyond clinical care to address systemic barriers that affected patient outcomes. Victoria's foundation provided ongoing support for his advanced education and professional development, creating opportunities for him to influence healthcare policy and patient advocacy at institutional levels. Victoria's business practices were fundamentally changed by her experience with Emma's illness and her friendship with Marcus, leading her to implement employee policies that prioritized work-life balance and family support over maximum productivity. Matthew's digital solutions became known for generous family leave policies, educational assistance programs, and healthcare benefits that reflected Victoria's new understanding of what constituted meaningful success in business. Her employees noticed the changes in her leadership style, describing her as more approachable, more empathetic, and more interested in their personal well-being than she had been during the company's early years. The relationship that developed between Victoria and Marcus after Emma's death was built on shared values and mutual respect rather than superficial attractions or convenient circumstances, creating a foundation for partnership that honored Emma's memory while also creating opportunities for continued positive impact in other people's lives. Their connection had been forged during the most difficult period of both their lives, tested by grief and loss, but strengthened by shared commitment to the kind of meaningful work that Emma had valued above all else. Emma's death had been devastating, but it had also catalyzed transformations that created purpose and direction neither Victoria nor Marcus had previously understood was possible. Years later, Victoria and Marcus would remember Emma's laughter filling the sterile perfection of the penthouse, her enthusiasm for their friendship, and her excitement about using her educational fund to support meaningful work that would help other families facing similar challenges. The foundation that Victoria established in Emma's memory had provided educational assistance to hundreds of nursing students, creating ripple effects of positive change that extended far beyond what any of them could imagine during those difficult weeks when Emma was dying. Marcus's career in pediatric oncology had touched the lives of countless families, providing advocacy and support that made medical crises more manageable while also influencing policy changes that improved healthcare access for low-income families.
Victoria's transformation from someone who dismissed service workers as invisible to someone who recognized the dignity and worth of every person had created changes in her business practices and personal relationships that honored Emma's memory through continued action rather than just remembrance. The assumptions and prejudices that had initially blinded her to Marcus's worth had been replaced by understanding that authentic human connection required seeing beyond superficial characteristics to the values and dreams that actually defined people's characters. Her wealth had provided opportunities to create positive change, but Emma's wisdom had taught her how to use those opportunities in ways that honored human dignity and created lasting impact. Marcus's journey from working multiple jobs to support his family to becoming a respected advocate for pediatric cancer patients represented the kind of transformation that Emma had envisioned when she decided to use her educational fund to support his nursing education. His success had been made possible by Emma's financial assistance, but it had been inspired by her courage, her wisdom, and her determination to create meaning even in the face of terminal illness. Every family he helped navigate the healthcare system, every policy change he influenced to improve patient advocacy, every nursing student he mentored represented extensions of Emma's impact that continued long after her death. The love story that emerged from tragedy was ultimately secondary to the more important story about Emma's ability to create connections that transcended social and economic differences, her vision for using resources to support work that would benefit other families facing medical crises, and her determination to find meaning and purpose even during the darkest moments of her illness. Her life had been brief but profound, creating changes in Victoria and Marcus that rippled outward to affect hundreds of other lives through their continued work in business ethics and healthcare advocacy. The pizza delivery that had seemed like a minor inconvenience in Victoria's carefully controlled world had actually been the beginning of connections that changed multiple lives in fundamental ways, proving that the most important relationships often began with the smallest interactions between people whose paths might never have crossed under different circumstances. Emma's illness and death had created opportunities for authentic human connection that transcended social and economic differences, while also inspiring commitments to service and positive change that honored her memory through continued action rather than just grief. The dismissive words Victoria had spoken during that first encounter with Marcus had been replaced by understanding, respect, and genuine partnership in work that mattered more than any business achievement or financial success either of them had previously imagined possible. Emma's hope had been fulfilled not through her own recovery, but through the recovery of human dignity and authentic connection between people who had learned to see beyond superficial differences to the values and dreams that actually mattered in the end.